Yokoso owashitare. Welcome back. The question I want to pose to you guys before this story begins is, what do you do when you have been completely and utterly defeated? And what did the ancient samurai do? What did they think about this? Because the image of the modern samurai is that after an inglorious defeat, you were supposed to ritually dispose of yourself. But as we will see here, that is definitely not the case for the ancient samurai, because we are continuing the story of the governor of Michinoku, Minamoto no Yoriyoshi, and his war against the Abe clan, and specifically the clan leader Abe no Sadato. So if you like Japanese history, you like storytelling, you like samurai and all that good stuff, please like the video, please subscribe to the channel, so you can stay informed when the videos regarding this story drop, because this is a multi-part series. And with all of that out of the way, let's get into the actual story. When last we left off, the governor of Michinoku, Minamoto no Yoriyoshi, had attacked the Emishi chieftain Abe no Sadato. However, he was utterly defeated, completely demolished by Chieftain Sadato. And luckily for the governor, he had managed to make it out alive with him and his sons and a few other retainers, but they had been soundly defeated and most of his men had died in battle. And as you can imagine, immediately following this victory, Chieftain Sadato began expanding his influence over the region, over these 6 districts of Michinoku. He began employing the people, as the text says, and sending out his men to go manage things. Now, one of these men in particular we have seen was a man by the name of Fujiwara no Tsunekiyo, who was the brother-in-law to Chieftain Sadato, and this Tsunekiyo in particular went down to the barrier at the Koromo River, which was the main thoroughfare, I guess you could say, into the northern Emishi lands, and he began sending out his own servants, his own underlings, and he gave them a very specific job. He wanted them to go collect taxes. And specifically, he instructed them saying, make sure that you use the white talismans and not the red ones. This is very, very important. Now, what are the white talismans and what are the red talismans? Luckily, the text actually explains what this is. So at this time, when people paid taxes, they didn't have money per se. They didn't have cash. They didn't really have coins. Actually, the people of the north oftentimes had gold, because gold was a famous commodity from the northern areas. But generally, when people paid their taxes, they paid in things like rice, cloth, and other local goods or handmade goods or whatever it was, things of value, because money wasn't really a thing. However, to indicate that certain things were paid as taxes as opposed to just being the regular things of whatever they were, you would stick a talisman on them. Specifically, you would stick a white piece of paper on them that was either stamped or inscribed with some kind of a red marking that indicated that these were actually set aside for the governor and eventually the capital. These were official taxes. And so that's what the red talisman meant, is that because it had the red insignia on it, it was a red tax indicator. However, the white indicators was basically just the white blank piece of paper that didn't have the insignia on it. And so they called it white. And the significance of this is, while red indicated that these things were supposed to go to the governor and eventually to the capital, the blank talismans indicated Tsunekiyo's own personal goods, the things that he claimed for himself. And so essentially what he was doing here is he was going in and he was getting taxes that had already been collected for the governor and for the capital and making them his own. He was claiming taxes for his own personal gain. And this was a big no-no, because not only was he not even a governor, he was some Emishi outsider who wasn't even a part of the Japanese people, the air quotes Yamato people, right? And normally, the governor would immediately put a stop to all of this. However, the governor had just been soundly and severely beaten. There was nothing he could do about it. And all this was to just demonstrate that when Abe no Sadato won this battle, he wasted no time in expanding his influence all over the region. However, Governor Yoriyoshi was not the kind of man to just roll over and let his enemies win. No. He had a job to do. He had been commanded by the court to go punish this rogue chieftain and bring him to justice, and he was going to do that come hell or high water. He only had one problem. He had lost the vast majority of the men he had recruited in the previous battle, and he was without troops. And yes, he could of course rally some more to his cause, but that would take time. Not to mention, the last time he attacked with troops that he had rallied from the nearby area, he had got his butt kicked. So he needed a change of strategy. So instead of immediately rallying troops from the province of Michinoku, he went over to the neighboring province of Dewa and began appealing to the chieftains of the Yamakita Emishi, the main patriarch of which was a man by the name of Kiyohara no Mitsuyori, and second in command was his younger brother Takenori. And Governor Yoriyoshi came to these men and asked them to side with him in the fight against the Abe clan. Now at first, Chieftain Yorimitsu was really hesitant about this. I mean, the Abe clan were their neighbors, and they had just defeated the governor's army soundly. And so he wasn't exactly keen on picking a fight with somebody who was right there, somebody whom he couldn't just run away from to the other side of the country if need be. No. If he was going to go fight his neighbors, the Abe clan, he needed to be absolutely sure that he could win. And even if he couldn't win necessarily, that's so much trouble, like seriously. However, Governor Yoriyoshi appealed to these men so sincerely and so earnestly, not to mention he also sent them a steady stream of very, very nice gifts, and eventually he won these two men over and they agreed that they would side with him in going to punish Abe no Sadato. And they notified Governor Yoriyoshi of this in a letter. And Mitsuyori specifically sent his younger brother Takenori, whom we will see a lot of, remember that name, Kiyohara no Takenori, and he sent his younger brother at the head of 10,000 warriors, 10,000 trained Emishi fighters. And when Governor Yoriyoshi received this letter and realized that he was about to get 10,000 men to fight for his cause, he was elated. Like, whoa! Holy crap, I needed help and these guys are delivering, jeez Louise, this is amazing. And so, in high spirits, Governor Yoriyoshi gathered his 3,000 men that he had managed to rally, and he set out to go meet this army of 10,000 Emishi warriors at the place of rendezvous, which was called Tamuragaoka in the district of Kurihara. And there, these two armies met up, Takenori's 10,000 and Yoriyoshi's 3,000, and they combined forces and began to organize their army. They separated it into the various divisions, and they placed leaders in charge of these separate divisions, and specifically the text mentions that all of the leaders were either the sons or the retainers of Chieftain Takenori. I'm assuming that they did this simply because Takenori was supplying the much greater part of the army, and so it only makes sense that his men were the one in charge, as most of these fighters knew who Takenori's retainers were and weren't as familiar with Yoriyoshi's men. But after getting everything organized and preparations set, Chieftain Takenori then turned towards the Heian capital, the capital of the Yamato state, and he put his hands together, and he began offering up a prayer. At the command of Governor Yoriyoshi, I have roused my sons and my men to fight on his behalf, and I do not fear death. Therefore, if it be your will, O triple gods of Hachiman, please bear witness to and illuminate my sincerity for all to see, and know that I will take no thought for sparing my own life. And when he said this prayer, it wasn't a quiet little thing that he kept to himself. He said this for all the army to hear. And everybody in earshot who heard this felt something in them, felt something stir, this motivation, this determination to go and fight and win. And also at the same time, everybody looked up and saw a single dove fly over this army. And everybody took that to be a sign that the gods had heard Takenori's prayer and that they had divine intervention on their side. And they all began worshiping this little dove. And so, in very high spirits, the army set out on the warpath. By the end of the first day, they managed to make it to the district of Iwai, and specifically to the place of Nakayama no Okazawa. And there they set up camp, and everything went well. And the next day, they continued on their path, and then they made it to the horse pastures known as Hagi in this same district, which was where they decided to set up camp, and was also very, very close to the first fortress that they were planning to attack. A fortress that was being managed by Sadato's brother, Muneto. Now when they first arrived, it was already fairly late in the day, and there were some other factors that the text doesn't go into detail about that persuaded them that maybe tonight might not be the best time to attack. So instead, they would take a break, rest through the night, rally their troops, and attack early in the morning tomorrow. But not today. We'll hold off for now. Now at the time, Takenori had some sons, as was already mentioned. Now you can imagine, if you're a young, hot-blooded Emishi warrior, and you're sitting on the edge of a battle, told that nothing is going to happen tonight, but you're raring for a fight, you're not just going to sit around and wait for the next day to come. No. How can we stand being here when we're about to have like the battle of our lives? Come on, let's go. And so, these sons of Takenori decided that they wanted to go on a scouting trip. They wanted to go around the fortress to see where the enemy was, where they had placed things, if there was any way they could attack better, things like that. And the text doesn't mention this until later. But what we can assume is that at least on one side of where this fortress was, there was a big cliff. Actually, I don't know if it was a big cliff, but there was a cliff. And the way I imagine it in my head is that at least on one side of where this fortress was, there was a cliff. And so maybe there was a nice slope up to it as it was on high ground, but at least on one side you couldn't get to there from normal means. And maybe you could ride up the hill straight at it if you so chose, but you know, that's an uphill battle, literally. However, these sons of Takenori were circling around this fortress, again, trying to see what they could see, when wouldn't you know it, they happened to come across a campsite of foot soldiers that was outside the walls of the fortress. And what do you do, again, if you're a hot-blooded young warrior who is told that you're not going to see any action tonight, but you just can't keep it in? Well, they torched it. They set the whole camp up ablaze. And this campsite was close enough to the fortress that when it went up in flames, everybody in the fortress started freaking out. Everybody started panicking and running around, getting together, getting their gear ready. They weren't entirely sure what was going on. And a bunch of them went up to the fortress walls and began throwing stones at Takenori's sons and trying to get them to go away. Now, of course, this did not go unseen by Governor Yoriyoshi and Takenori, who looked out across the battlefield, saw the smoke and the fire, saw that everybody inside the fortress was freaking out, and Governor Yoriyoshi turned to Takenori and said, "We did plan that we were going to hold off the attack until tomorrow, but it seems like the battle has already begun. And we do not get to choose when we fight. I suppose we just have to head out now." And Takenori simply nodded his head and said, "So it seems." And then they too began making preparations for battle. Now at some point, I don't know if this was at the behest of the governor or Takenori or what, but there were two men. The first by the name of Fukae no Korenori, and the second by the name of Otomo no Kazuhide. And these two men got together about 20 or so stalwart, really exceptionally brave warriors, and they went over to the base of the cliff that the fortress was on top of. And I don't know how believable this is, but specifically what the text says is that they used their swords to dig holes into the side of the cliff, and then sticking spears into these holes, they then climbed the cliff face all the way up to the top, and now found themselves at the walls of this fortress. And then together, they managed to break down the walls there, and drawing their swords, they sprinted into the middle of the fortress and started cutting down everybody that they could find. And what's worth noting, up until this point, when samurai have fought, they have always fought with bows and arrows from horseback. However, in this instance, you're definitely not going to be bringing horses up the side of a cliff face. And also, in the fortress, there isn't a lot of room to maneuver a horse around or to fire a bow comfortably. So of course, they're going to turn to their next best weapon, the sword. And this is when we see samurai fight with swords. And so you can imagine the chaos that this entire fortress has now erupted in. There's a fire outside that might end up spreading to the actual fort, and now there's a bunch of enemies inside just tearing the place up. And I guess it was just at this time that Muneto actually left the fortress with a contingent of about 800 men to go confront the army of Yoriyoshi and Takenori. However, if you remember what the numbers were, 800 men versus somewhere in the realm of 10,000, those aren't good odds for Muneto. And so, inevitably, with this three-pronged attack, Muneto's army was eventually broken and scattered. They began running deeper into Emishi territory to try to get away. Along the way, they did manage to set fire to their own fortress in the hopes that at the very least the enemy would not be able to make use of it. And then, they disappeared. Now normally, you would expect that Minamoto no Yoriyoshi would pursue these men and try to finish the job. However, for whatever reason, he decided against that, and that it was better for them to regroup, re-rally, count everybody, make sure everybody was here, make sure everything was in order, before continuing the campaign. The only problem is that in the course of making sure everything was together, it started raining. And it rained, and it rained, and it rained, and it rained. For 18 days straight, it continuously rained. And for whatever reason, this meant that the army could not move forward, that they were kind of stuck in this area. And the problem with keeping 10,000 men in one area is you're gonna end up running out of food. And they were starting to run thin on supplies and other goods. And so, in order to keep the men there, Yoriyoshi decided that he was going to send a good chunk of the men out into the surrounding area to go find food for themselves. I mean, maybe they were going to pillage, maybe they were going to hunt, not entirely sure, but he just needed to send them out so they could go take care of themselves, and then that way they could actually stay there. Now, somehow, this information made it to Abe no Sadato, who decided that this was a prime opportunity to strike. That while a good chunk of Yoriyoshi's men were out and about looking for food and not there to fight, and considering he had home advantage, he then rallied together a bunch of men and attacked, coming in very swift and almost unseen. But he was up against some pros at this point. Again, Yoriyoshi the governor himself was already a proven warrior, and Chieftain Takenori was also an Emishi chieftain who was very familiar with war. And so despite attacking at perhaps what might have been the most opportune time, he and his army were eventually beaten back and scattered yet again. Only this time, when Sadato's army began retreating, the governor wasn't going to make the same mistake twice, and he told his men, after them, we are going to finish this as soon as we can. And so he chased them all the way to another fortress called Ishizaka, and there, another battle broke out. And the same thing happened. Sadato's army was defeated, and they decided to hightail it on out of there. This time, retreating to the fortress at the barrier of Koromogawa. Now this fortress was also like the previous fortress in that it was a very easily defensible place, partly because there was cliffs on one side, and there was a river, the Koromo River, on the other. Plus, there were trees surrounding it all over the place, which again made maneuvering horses very, very difficult. So as Governor Yoriyoshi was looking at this fortress and planning the next attack, he decided that he was going to split up the army into 3 sections. And of course he appointed leaders for each of these sections and began making plans to go deal with this. How best to attack this very, very defensible position. But one of the advantages of having one of your main leaders be an Emishi chieftain who didn't fight like the rest of the Japanese warlords, while Yoriyoshi was sitting here concocting your typical plans of probably siege warfare or whatever they were going to try to do, Takenori hopped off of his horse and he walked over to the bank of the river, and looking at things for a little bit, he turned to one of his men, a man by the name of Hisakiyo, and he told him, "You see these trees on both sides of the river here? Not only are they very large trees, but they are very heavily bent too. So much so that their branches cover the entire face of the river. And I know that you, sir, are actually very light on your feet, as well as extremely agile. So here's what I want from you. I want you to use your agility to cross this river through the trees, go up to the fortress, and set fire to a portion of it. And when I see the smoke and the flames, that is when I will take the better part of the army and we will attack the front gate. And if we do that, this fortress is sure to fall." And so Takenori's man Hisakiyo accepted this mission, grabbed a single rope, grabbed a handful of men, and went to the banks of this river. And tying the rope to a tree on one side of the river, he then took to the trees and flew across the river through the branches like a monkey, the text specifically says. And then landing on the other side of the river, he then tied that end to another tree, and with using this rope, he managed to get about 30 warriors across the river safely. And together, these warriors then wound their way up to the fortress, and they successfully set fire to a portion of it. Now, as soon as the fire began, Abe no Sadato saw this, and perhaps thinking about what had happened at the previous fortress that they had had a big battle at, he decided that, you know what, I'm not going to deal with this, we're in a bad situation, we just need to get out. And so without any battle being met, Abe no Sadato then retreated to the next fortress deeper in his lands, the fortress of Tonomi, which was actually the fortress that his father had died at in the previous campaign. Now apparently Governor Yoriyoshi had learned a thing or two, because almost as soon as Abe no Sadato retreated with his men to this other fortress, Governor Yoriyoshi was hot on his heels. So hot on his heels, in fact, that by the time they had arrived at this other fortress, Tonomi, Abe no Sadato had not had enough time to prepare his defenses properly. And so yet again, without there being any battle, Abe no Sadato took his army and retreated even further into Emishi territory. And just like that, Governor Yoriyoshi and Chieftain Takenori were able to occupy this great fortress. And it was at this point that Governor Yoriyoshi decided that they had pursued their enemy relentlessly all the way up until this point. His men were probably tired and they needed a break. And so having this nice fancy fortress all to themselves now, a nice defensible position where they weren't going to get attacked by Abe no Sadato out of nowhere again, he said, "Hey men, take a second, relax, catch your breath, recuperate, and we'll begin the fighting at a later time." Which was great news. And it became even greater news when, as the men were exploring this fortress, they came across a room that was full of booze. Tons and tons of sake. And they were thrilled about this. This was great. Like, oh my gosh, now we get free drinks and a chance to chill. And so they all began preparations to start having a good time. But right as they were about to start drinking, Governor Yoriyoshi came in and said, "No, stop. Do not drink that. I'm almost positive that is poisoned." Which actually makes a whole lot of sense. I mean, you don't want your enemies having a good time, and you don't want them getting your supplies. So if you can't take the supplies with you because you're hurriedly trying to retreat, the very least you can do is poison it. That's just standard war. And so the men were kind of bummed about that, but like, what are you gonna do? I mean, do you want to be the guy who tries to test drink the sake, and if it's poisoned, you be the first to die? I mean, go nuts, knock yourself out. But apparently there was one among them who really, really wanted a drink. He wanted something so bad. He was so thirsty, you guys, you don't even know. And so he secretly snuck in and managed to take some big gulps. I'm assuming they're big gulps, I don't know. I mean, if you're desperate enough to drink what might potentially be poisoned drink, you're probably not going to just take a couple of sips, is all I'm saying. And I don't know if he did this with other people watching, but the word got out that he had consumed some of this alcohol, and nothing happened. He was fine, totally fine. I mean, probably a little bit tipsy at the very least, but, you know, that's sake for you. And then everybody realized that it wasn't poisoned, so yes, we have drink! This is great, this is wonderful. And so, with all of that done, Governor Yoriyoshi and his men hunkered down in this new fortress with free drink and time to chill, and were probably in very, very good spirits. And actually, that is where I'm going to end this portion of the story for now. But the war is not over. Now we just have a little brief respite, and we will continue the campaign of the former 9 Years' War at a later time. So, if you enjoyed this story, please give the video a like, and please, again, subscribe to the channel because there will be one more video that will wrap this whole thing up, so please subscribe so you are aware when that drops. But if you have questions for me, please feel free to leave a comment. I can't promise that I'll be able to answer it. I am not a credentialed expert. I'm just a nerd who really likes classical Japanese literature. And if you have been watching all the way up into the end here, I thank you sincerely. Ito katajike no koso haberikere, and hopefully we will see you in the next one for the conclusion to this former 9 Years' War. So, again, thank you very much, and we'll see you later. Goodbye.